Okay, we can get started. So welcome back. Well, you've been here the whole day today, but welcome to our 220 session, session 3K, Environmental Justice Highlights from the National Wildlife Federation. Again, my name is Dr. Sacoby Wilson. I'm director of the Center for Community Engagement, Environmental Health, the host for this seventh UMD EJ Symposium. With us today from the National Wildlife Federation, we have Jessica Arriens, Program Manager, Climate and Energy Policy, Samantha Lockhart, Eastern Regional Field Director, Nizhooni Hurd, Coordinator, Tribal Program Partnerships, Crystal Jennings, Senior Manager, Youth Leadership Program, Rebeca, I'm gonna mispronounce your name, Villegas, right?
Villegas,
Villegas,
perfect.
okay. Senior Program Manager, Environmental Justice for the National Wildlife Federation. So the Federation is undertaking a number of projects to serve communities with EJ issues and striving to do work, looking at impacts, sharing resources and co-developing recommendations from federal policy. So today the panelists are going to talk about several of these projects related to COVID, equitable clean economy, recommendations related to President Biden's executive order on climate change and developing environmental justice indicators for a new screening tool, and also talk about President Biden's Justice 40 initiative and how big greens can be better engaged in this work. And so what we're going to do now is to have the team present some slides. Rachel, can we give them share screen? Who's going to present the slides? Okay, cool. You have the floor.
All right, well, thank you, Dr. Wilson. Thank you, everybody, for joining today, and thank you again for all the incredible work that you've done and in really amplifying environmental justice. And so, as Dr. Wilson had mentioned, we're going to share a little bit about some of the different initiatives and projects, and also the connection with Big Greens, given that National Wildlife Federation is a Big Green. And so to kick us off, we have to face the reality. Big Greens have historically not done enough to address environmental injustices that people face for several potential reasons. One can argue it's easier to get people to care about charismatic megafauna such as polar bears or elephants, as opposed to getting people to care about other people. But I believe it's because white supremacy culture is deeply embedded in the conservation and environmental movement, which was cultivated by several racist leaders, including John Muir, Gifford Pinchot, Teddy Roosevelt, and many more that you can read about in The Rise of the Conservation Movement by Dr. Dorceta Taylor. And I mention this not to discount their work and overall outcomes, but because the way in which the conservation and environmental movement began was institutionalized through white supremacy culture tactics that really harmed Black, Indigenous, Latino, Asian, and communities through land theft, forced displacement, exclusion, and much more. And for decades, Big Greens such as the National Wildlife Federation have been able to cultivate resources, expand networks with folks, policymakers, build power through inherited tactics, right, such as focusing on grass top efforts, as opposed to really building community power and working with folks. But these antiquated tactics, they're just not enough, right? As we read through the recently released Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we must galvanize support now, we must act now. In order to be able to achieve success, we need to be able to center people and take into account history, take into account systems, and cultivate new and innovative ways to address conservation issues. And folks might ask, how do we do this? How do we get this started? How do we move forward? And so I look forward to sharing a little bit of some of the examples that we've been able to do here at the Environmental Justice Program at the National Wildlife Federation, how we've been able to use our resources, use our privilege to build community power and uplift equitable practices and policies in our circles of influence. So to begin, our program has really been built on over a decade of work that has been led by Simone Lightfoot, our Associate Vice President of Environmental Justice and Climate Justice, through the Urban Initiatives Program. And through the Urban Initiatives and Environmental Justice Program, we've been able to build authentic relationships with organizations, community leaders, government agencies, minority serving institutions, and so forth, which have been fundamental to our ability to understand the issues that are happening on the ground. During the onset of the Flint water crisis, for example, the Federation was quick to respond to the public health crisis. By leveraging the Federation's national media platform, we were able to amplify the work and the issues that were happening in Flint. And in collaboration with community, social justice, civil rights, faith, public health, labor, and other different environmental groups in Flint, we're able to bring forth a 16-member delegation to Washington, D.C. to lobby for water infrastructure funding. And through the coalition, the Federation was instrumental in securing over $100 million to fund drinking water infrastructure for the city of Flint in 2016. And although, we still have a long way to go, Flint still residents do not have access to clean and affordable water. We're still there working in the community, making sure that the issues continue to be uplifted and working with different folks on the ground. And in addition to working with different communities such as Flint, we also have different connections and relationships with folks in Birmingham, Alabama. There, we've developed a program with community leaders to address climate-induced flooding, water and sewage, infrastructure, and public health issues impacting city residents. And we were able to work with community organizations to develop a green summer work experience program for youth, which is geared towards projects that revitalize their neighborhoods. And we're also currently working with the city department officials and residents to address water and sewage affordability and flood relief efforts. In addition, we've also worked with different minority serving institutions, such as historically Black colleges and universities, to engage students on science-based projects. And this year we worked with Grambling State University and other universities as well on projects to restore the Mississippi River watershed, which was a great opportunity for us to really understand the issues at hand and for students to get some hands-on experience on conservation environmental issues. In addition to working with folks on the ground, we've also led several different national initiatives to address the pertinent issues that are happening currently and that are going to impact our communities or have impacted our communities. In 2020, for example, we collaborated with partners, including Dr. Wilson and the environmental justice team and folks across the Federation to organize the COVID-19 Environmental Justice Roundtable series. And through this series, we're able to gather more than 124 frontline and fence line community leaders, elected officials, and other key experts and environmental justice stakeholders to discuss the impacts of the coronavirus on our communities. And we had some really great conversations about the intersectional issues facing folks. So not only did we talk about water issues and infrastructure and climate, we talked about access to broadband and how that's impacted folks and the ability for folks to even have access to education. So all these different issues we've been able to discuss, and we were able to amplify through a national town hall on environmental justice with frontline communities. And we did that to be able to also share the publication that we pulled together, which we've been able to compile all the different policy recommendations that folks had voiced during the roundtables. And again, an opportunity for us to use our different media platforms to make sure folks understand what's happening and what folks can do in terms of making sure that we move forward and address the intersectional issues that are facing our communities. And last year, we also began our Creating Safe Spaces initiative to address the disparities communities of color face when safely accessing outdoor green spaces. For many Black, Indigenous, people of color, recreating outside may involve facing microaggressions, harassment, acts of violence. And whether these instances happen in national parks or local green spaces, folks face different unique challenges and barriers that move away from just physically not being able to access an area, but what are the other issues that they're facing and how can we chart a path forward? In order to do this, National Wildlife Federation, we launched our Creating Safe Spaces initiative, and we wanted to hear from folks that are champions in this space already. And in December 2020, we partnered with Outdoor Afro, Billings Incorporated, Patagonia, and Black AF in STEM to shed light on the challenges that many Black people face through a series of roundtable discussions. And we also culminated into a national town hall on creating safe spaces to, again, amplify the realities that folks are facing and to also amplify the recommendations that folks had voiced. We also pulled together a report with different recommendations as well that, again, came from folks and are knowledgeable of how we need to move forward to address the various disparities. And we seek to also gather different identity groups in the future to discuss impediments and recommendations to enhance safe and healthy outdoor experiences for all. And quite recently, we also initiated the Clean Economy Coalition of Color, or CEEJH for short. And it's an alliance of Black, Latino, Indigenous, Asian, and Pacific Islander leaders and advocates of color that are committed to uplifting priorities and economic interests of historically marginalized communities. This coalition meets on a regular basis to share resources, to build capacity among organizations, to unpack legislation, to discuss policies, to discuss how we need to make sure that equitable practices move forward, and to also highlight some amazing leaders of color in the space already that are operating in the clean economy sector, to share best practices and lessons learned, so that as we advocate and work with folks on the Hill, we know what to raise and to amplify, and who to connect with as well, and who to uplift. And we're currently in the midst of creating a set of different principles and recommendations that we've been able to culminate through these various discussions to advance equitable practices and policies, to guide federal investments as our nation transitions to a newer and cleaner forms of energy. And all this information, again, as we talk about working with different folks on the ground and different projects and initiatives, have been able to be a better advocate and leader in this space. And so we've been able to apply the lessons learned, the recommendations through our engagement on the Hill, for example, and whether that's through various hearings that we've been participated in to, again, connect and discuss the intersectional issues that are happening with COVID and other systems that have been compiled over decades, or when we are meeting with different staffers about legislation and bills that they want to introduce. We've been able to use the lessons that we've been able to garner to really make sure that we're amplifying equitable practices and policies as we continue to move forward. And so I'll stop there, and I'll hand it off to my colleague, Sam Lockhart, to talk a little bit more about the democracy work that she's been leading here at the Federation and the role of big greens in this space. Thank you.
Thanks, Rebeca. Wow, it's amazing hearing all of that work laid out. And I know so much of it is work that you really led on and did. So thank you for everything. I'm going to spend, like Rebeca said, I'm Sam Lockhart. I use she, her, hers pronouns. And I'm going to spend the next few minutes just talking a little bit about democracy and voting rights and our work in this space. And, one question we often get is, why is a wildlife organization working on democracy? Maybe that's not a question you all have because you're more savvy here. But like all advocacy organizations, I can tell you this is not altruistic. Like all advocacy organizations, our power is really derived from an unspoken threat that if our representatives in government fail to enact and support policies that protect our environment, wildlife, communities, we're going to vote them out of office. So if our voters, environmental voters, are being kept from the ballot box and their power is being undermined, then that threat is toothless. And we really, as an organization, have no power. So we really rely on a functioning and healthy democracy in order to do all of our work to advocate for wildlife and people. So we started, next slide. This started really back in 2019, leading into the 2020 election cycle. We knew we wanted to do some work in the civic engagement space. So we worked first on partnering with a lot of amazing organizations, but we were lucky enough to be a partner on the first ever presidential forum on environmental justice at the end of 2019. In 2020, we did a lot of work around civic engagement and just educating folks about how to register to vote and get absentee ballots. And Crystal is going to talk a little bit more about a specific on-the-ground initiative related to civic engagement and voter outreach. We did some work just educating our audience about the importance of the census, and particularly the census's connection to environmental justice and how communities access funding and why it's so important to be counted. But really at the end of 2020, I'd been working as a representative for National Wildlife Federation, along with folks from League of Conservation Voters, Sierra Club, Greenpeace, Natural Resources Defense Council, Environmental Defense Fund, Clean Water Action, and other sort of big green groups in DC. We've been meeting really throughout 2020, at first really to talk about how the environmental community would respond if Donald Trump was to win a second term. But we started to pivot as we got closer to the election, because we had to face this increasingly likely scenario that we were actually going to have to fight to ensure that votes were counted. And that the election was upheld regardless of the outcome, that actually the votes and voices of voters were going to be honored by our democracy. And I think we can all see why that was so important, as we know now what happened over the 2020 election cycle. This was something we knew as National Wildlife Federation. We are not the leaders in the democracy space. We haven't been in the space a long time. So we were really listening to pro-democracy organizations that had been doing incredible work for years and years. and really trying to think about how we as an organization can lend our power, our voice to what was going on. And so we were really being asked to continue this drumbeat of count every vote, and to really educate our audiences and prepare folks for the idea that it might take some time to count all the votes in the 2020 election, because we had so many more absentee votes and mail-in voting, and we weren't really prepared we didn't have the infrastructure to count those quickly. And so it was going to take maybe weeks or longer to get a result, and we needed to prepare our audience for that. And so we started, along with folks in the environmental community and really across the, you probably heard the hashtag count every vote at some point last year, because it was really everywhere, and the democracy community did a great job really putting it out there, and we were able to kind of fit into that message and speak to our audience as well. So next slide. That takes us to January 6th, which was a pivotal moment in history and for our organization. Like a ton of organizations and out there in 2020, we had made a ton of public commitments to strive to be an anti-racist organization. And we'd also, as Rebeca mentioned, heard from so many roundtable participants that the importance of removing barriers to voting. And now we were facing a moment in our history where literally white supremacists were storming the Capitol and trying to overturn a free and fair election. We had to do and say something. This is a real moment for us as an organization, I think for a lot of folks. I wish I could say that we were out front, that we knew right away what we needed to do and how to do it. We were behind a lot of the other green groups, not just the democracy community folks or folks like NAACP, who of course were amazing leaders right away, but a lot of our partners in the green space, Sierra Club and others, were really out ahead of us. It took us some time to really respond. We're new in this space, and we had a lot of internal soul searching to do to figure out how to move forward. But ultimately, we were able to put out a statement calling for the removal of President Trump from office. And we actually formed a Defense of Democracy staff working group across the organization to come together and try and figure out how to respond, what we needed to say, and what accountability would look like as we continue to try and work with members of Congress who had essentially expressed that they didn't want to uphold the will of the people. So we didn't do all the right things. We didn't do enough. But we did want to try and do something. And so I think we were able to do some things I'm really proud of. We put out, again, I mentioned the statement, we did an action alert around the impeachment of Donald Trump that garnered almost 13,000 signers to tell their senators to vote to impeach Donald Trump. We did a click to call alert as well, driving phone calls into offices around that impeachment vote. We joined sign-on letters within the environmental community. We did social media advocacy. But obviously, we also knew that just responding to January 6th as though it was an isolated moment in history was not sufficient, because equal access to the vote has been a foundational fight in racial and social justice movement since the beginning of our country. I mean, this is a foundational fight. This is just the latest chapter. So we knew that we couldn't just pretend like it was January 6th and then move on, say, good job, we put out our statement. We needed to really honor our commitment by working to shore up our democracy overall. And the next big thing we were hearing from the democracy community, and really we get a lot of our information from the Declaration for American Democracy Coalition, was to support the For the People Act, and also the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. So next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about where we are right now with democracy, and then what we've been doing as National Wildlife Federation. So number one is that our voting rights are absolutely under attack. Between January and June of 2021, 17 states have enacted 28 new laws that restrict access to the vote. On July 1st of this year, the Supreme Court upheld voting rights restrictions in Arizona, even as it was acknowledged by the majority opinion that the impact of those restrictions would disproportionately impact Latinx and Indigenous people. And this is on top of the 2013 Supreme Court decision that got rid of the Voting Rights Act provisions that required formerly Jim Crow states to have changes to their voting laws reviewed by the Department of Justice. This was famously former Supreme Court Justice, rest in peace, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, called this throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. So basically we had these voting rights protections and they were working. And so everyone said, oh, we don't need them anymore, got rid of them. And as expected, shortly after that decision, discriminatory voting bills flourished in states across the country. And that's really ramped up in the last few months following the 2020 election cycle. So the For the People Act is also called HR1 or S1 in the Senate, is a really visionary and transformational piece of legislation that addresses a lot of foundational issues within our democracy. Number one among those is voting access. It creates a lot of more access to the vote, same-day voter registration, online and automatic voter registration, increasing poll workers. There's also anti-gerrymandering provisions that ban partisan and racial gerrymandering. There's campaign finance reform measures that get money out of politics and counter the Citizens United decision. There are some government ethics reforms pieces that are really critical. Where are things with the For the People Act? The bill has passed the House, so yay. It was introduced in the Senate. It was voted out of committee along party lines. And it didn't reach a 60 vote threshold on the floor of the Senate, which was required to even open the floor to debate. So Republicans have blocked debate in the Senate on this bill. And right now, Democrats are negotiating to make compromises to the bill. And what's going to come out is something that looks slightly different than For the People Act, and we're going to assess what it looks like and whether we can still support and advocate for it. But Senate Majority Leader Schumer has said that this is going to be the first thing the Senate takes up when they come back from recess. So that's going to be around mid-September. Keep your eyes peeled. It's going to be a really critical moment. The second piece is the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, or HR4, which addresses the 2013 Supreme Court decision I mentioned by establishing new legislation to create a process for reviewing changes to voting nationwide and focusing on the types of measures that have been historically used to discriminate against voters. It was introduced just last week in the House of Representatives, and it's expected to see a vote on the floor of the House this Tuesday. So happening again, another thing, this is all very relevant and real time stuff that's going on. Next slide. So what have we done? We have been working with that group of big greens that I mentioned to really collaborate and speak with as much with one voice as possible as the environmental community to emphasize how action for our democracy is really linked to protecting the environment. And we've been advocating for the For the People Act. We sent out an action alert to our members and activists, and just NWF got about 10,000 actions sent in to senators in support of that bill. And collectively, the entire environmental community generated nearly 150,000 messages to Congress. In June, we partnered with our environmental partners to host a teach-in on the assault to our freedom to vote and how the For the People Act combats this. And that event was viewed 19,800 times across YouTube and Facebook. So just demonstrating our power when we all come together as the environmental community. We signed on to sign-on letters. We sent those letters to Congress. We've joined statements. We've continued to engage our audiences on social media around this legislation. There's so much more we can and should be doing at this critical moment for our democracy. But that's a little bit about how we've been really trying to move into this space. And I'm going to stop there, because I'm probably over 10 minutes already, and hand things over to my incredible colleague, Crystal Jennings, to talk about the Earth Tomorrow program.
Thanks, Rebecca. And thank you all for allowing me to be a part of this discussion, the dream team, the organizers of this event. I'm just really happy to be here and talk a little bit about the Earth Tomorrow program. Where I would like to start, actually, just to keep some of the information about voter engagement going. If it's okay, Rebecca, I'll save the video for last, but I would like to just start off, if you can skip to the first slide, just talking a little bit about what Earth Tomorrow is, so you understand the context. And then again, I'll save a really exciting video for you all towards the end of my talk. Earth Tomorrow, really quick, is in its 20th year of operation in Atlanta, which I'm so excited about that. It is an environmental justice education program and a leadership development program, primarily created for Black and Brown youth. And again, doing it in Atlanta for 20 years. It is a program, one of the longest standing, actually, environmental justice education programs of the National Wildlife Federation. So again, that's something I'm very, very proud of, that this program has been a part of the Federation for a really long time. So we can legitimately say, we've been doing this work with youth. We've been definitely working with Black and Brown youth and educating them around the issues related to environmental justice and how they can address those different issues in their community. A big part of this program, I won't read everything on the slide here, but is really about engaging high school students in community learning and civic engagement. So when we say civic engagement, naturally for us, it really meant, getting students out to do community service projects, connecting them with organizations that are on the grounds, that are, again, really taking action to make a difference in their community, whether it be through organizing cleanups or doing a community assessment event, or just helping people become more aware of the issues that exist in their communities. But with some support from NWF's Action Board and Clean and Prosperous America, we really turned a lot of our work into working on civic engagement through a voter engagement initiative. You can go to the next slide. So I'm really excited. We started, sorry, I know that's the video. You could save it. I guess skip to the next slide. Thank you. So we really based our initiative around John Lewis, and really he's very beloved for us in our community. A lot of people may or may not know, but he's a huge environmental justice champion. And we're thinking about his quote that the vote is the most powerful nonviolent tool that we have, and we must use it. So we really wanted to get our students informed on how voting is a tool and how they can use it, even if some of them were not old enough to vote yet. Again, we're working primarily with high school students through the Earth Tomorrow program. So if you can go to the next slide. So the next few slides are just some photos that really highlight some of the different on the ground events that we did over the course of, I would say, from September 2020 till January 2021, after the Senate runoff election. Obviously, Georgia had a big opportunity to show up, and our main goal as part of the Earth Tomorrow program was really just to help get out the vote. We're C3, so under our work, we couldn't support candidates, but we could definitely say that it's important that you know who's running. It's important that you know the facts. It's important that you know where they stand on certain environmental issues. So we had a voter engagement. We had a voter drive-through rally. Again, we're still working through COVID, so we had to make sure to keep everything safe. And we had people come through. We shared this pamphlet that you see up here so that they could get some of that information that I was talking about. Obviously, you can go to the next slide. Obviously, there was a big push to make sure that people had a plan to vote and that people were getting out to vote early, because we know very well that voter suppression is live and well. I mean, we've had wonderful people in the state of Georgia like Stacey Abrams really fighting to make sure that everyone had a fair chance to vote, but we still knew that there was going to be a lot of stuff going on. So we wanted to make sure that people had a plan to vote. That was the first message, and that people voted early. So we had our students to come out and help be a part of this event. This is actually a picture from Decatur, Georgia, which you don't usually see Ranger Rick in Decatur, Georgia. So it really helped to put our name as a big green organization out there in areas where we typically haven't been seen. And here we are helping to get out the vote. You can go to the next slide. So again, you see 3 of our students here. One is an alumni college students, 2 are current students of Earth Tomorrow programs that are standing on the side of the street, telling people come in, grab some voter kits, which included refillable water bottles. And again, the pamphlet information where they can scan. We also talked to a number of people in the community who had questions. We got to connect with other organizations that were also out in the field doing this work. And you can go to the next slide. Just to make sure I stay on track here. Again, you see community member here that's scanning and getting more information, asking us questions. We really got to be that organization that said, not only are we saying we need to go out and vote, but we're out here in the community, we're talking to people, we're reminding them of important dates, we're reminding them of some issues that can come up, we're making sure that they know about the candidates on the ballot. So you can go to the next slide. So at the end of the day, again, and this is just showing more, community members out there that we had a really fortunate chance to talk to, and you can go to the next slide. But most importantly, I also wanted to make a point again that we met people that didn't know that National Wildlife Federation had a program like Earth Tomorrow in Atlanta. So the two gentlemen on the right are actually from Civic, Georgia. We connected kind of like what Sam talked about with a number of organizations that were already doing a lot to get out. You know, we can't come out here and say, you know, we're new on the block. So we wanted to connect with other people that really knew what methods worked and could help us get out there and make a bigger difference. So Civic Georgia, Peaches to the Polls, we worked with the organization called March On, which I'm really excited about. They actually just texted me about an event that they would like for our students to attend coming up in August. So you can go to the next slide. So as you can see, it was just so many wonderful things that came out of us being able to engage in this voter education initiative. We also, similar to what Sam talked about, did a big social media push. I mean, we're working with high school students. So we knew we had to meet them where they were. We really wanted them to be able to do some peer-to-peer engagement. So we encouraged them to share a lot of posts that we curated just around the Georgia Senate runoff elections. We did a election day live event where we were down at the polls so they could see what was actually going on at the polls. Again, we just kept reminding them, a lot of this was happening throughout the holidays. So, you know, people might not have been in places where they could get information about getting out the vote, but we made sure that we kept that drumbeat going using our social media campaigns to do that. And you can go to the next slide. We were excited. We feel like we really made a difference. Again, getting involved and get out the vote. Over 4.4 million Georgians got out to vote. That was success. Our Earth Tomorrow program and our students got to really be a part of making history in Georgia. So moving forward, we're again continuing to find our place in how we can encourage youth to get out to vote. Even again, if they're not of age, it's never too early to start talking about them, to start talking to them about the importance of the tool of voting and how you can use that to help make a difference when it comes to environmental justice issues. So I will stop there because, like I said, I had a video. Anytime I get a chance to highlight the Earth Tomorrow program, I love to do that. So I'm going to let Rebeca play that video and look forward to answering any questions you all may have towards the end of this discussion. And thank you.
Earth Tomorrow Atlanta began in 2001 when Dr. Nataki Osborne-Jelks brought the program to Atlanta after seeing the magic of the Earth Tomorrow program in Detroit, started by NWF's Carrie Stanton. Nataki spent a week with students from Detroit public schools and admired how youth of color, primarily Black students, were learning about the environment and being equipped with skills to address environmental concerns in their schools and local communities, while also being exposed to environmental careers.
After I spent that week with the team in Detroit and with the students from Detroit Public Schools, I was completely sold on Earth Tomorrow, and I just knew that this was something that we had to bring to Atlanta.
Earth Tomorrow Atlanta started as a leadership development and environmental education program with civic engagement, career development, and environmental justice at its core. High school students across Metro Atlanta, particularly in Black and Brown communities, had an opportunity to join a school-based Earth Tomorrow club and participate in year-round activities geared towards connecting Black and other youth of color to the natural world, while educating them on the history of environmentalism and the solutions to address issues like water pollution, poor air quality, illegal dumping, climate change, food insecurity, and other environmental justice issues common to urban areas.
It teaches you so much about leadership development, community advocacy, and advocacy among one's environment.
Earth Tomorrow students are able to participate in programming year-round that helps boost their understanding of issues and solutions to big world problems. In addition, students from various Earth Tomorrow clubs are invited to participate in the Earth Tomorrow Summer Institute. Summer Institute is a week-long residential camp that combines all components of the program into daily environmental and leadership themes, explored through hands-on service projects, field trips, engaging speaker presentations, and group discussions. Students also get plenty of opportunities to make new friends, enjoy nature, and connect with environmental professionals.
and I've been a part of Earth Tomorrow since my freshman year in high school, and I've always looked forward to the Summer Institute every year.
Today, Earth Tomorrow is rooted in the same foundation: leadership development, environmental justice, civic engagement, career development, and equitable access to nature and programming created specifically for Black and Brown youth. However, each year we work to build out new opportunities for students to get a deeper understanding of the history of environmental racism. As Americans are coming to understanding the long-standing racial inequities experienced by Black Americans and other people of color, it's becoming more and more important to have programs that aren't shying away from helping students connect the dots. Environmental justice is social justice. Earth Tomorrow is that program. The goal for Earth Tomorrow over the last 20 years has always been to cultivate the next generation of environmental leaders and lifelong environmental stewards, which include activists, professionals, educators, volunteers, innovators, youth making their imprint on how people will live and thrive on the Earth tomorrow. It's exciting to have so many examples of Earth Tomorrow past participants who are now adults sharing what Earth Tomorrow means to them.
Hi, and thank you for being a part of the 20th anniversary of Earth Tomorrow. I just want to say thank you to all of the people that have supported our program, all of the students that have been a part of our program, and all of the community members that have also contributed to the success of our program. I want to say it one more time. Happy anniversary, Earth Tomorrow.
Happy 20th anniversary, Earth Tomorrow.
Happy 20th anniversary, Earth Tomorrow.
Happy 20th anniversary, Earth Tomorrow.
Happy anniversary, Earth Tomorrow.
Thank you for playing that whole thing. You probably could have cut it at some point, but I appreciate that. So I'm going to pass it on now to my colleague, Nizhooni Hurd, to talk more about tribal partnerships and programs. Take it over, Nizhooni.
Hi, thank you so much, everyone. I hope you all can hear me okay. Hurd, and I am the Tribal Partnerships Program Coordinator for the National Wildlife Federation. I've just previously joined the team in November, and so I'm still in this amazing learning and growing and really learning all the ins and outs of NWF, a lot of the history of the organization as well. And so I'm here to just share what I've learned and some of the work that the Tribal Partnerships Program is doing. And so I'll start with saying that the Tribal Partnerships Program, we aim to help remove or diminish these barriers by partnering authentically with tribes to build the strength of the tribal voice in wildlife conservation. And so a distinctive feature of the tribal program is that we focus on relational and transformational work with conservation outcomes and transactions as a result of strong and robust partnerships with tribes. And so what I mean by that is back in the 90s, there was a colleague of ours, Tom Doitery, and he worked for the National Wildlife Federation. And he began to start building relationships with people like Jason Valdez's dad. And Jason Valdez is our tribal buffalo program manager. And he's been with the organization for a while now. And there was those relationships with his dad on the Wind River Reservation. And it was starting to have a conversation about connecting values that we all have, whether it's a big green organization or a tribal nation or tribal community. And so from that, it was more conversations about working on the Yellowstone buffalo. They were coming out of the park and getting shot because there was a fear of disease that the buffalo had. And so then it started with Jason's dad, and then we get to working with tribes and the Intertribal Buffalo Council. And the Intertribal Buffalo Council also started coming up in the 90s as well. And so as those relationships developed, this leads to dialogue about species. And this is also the initial relationship about buffalo, which grew to other issues that the tribal partnerships has expanded to helping with. If we can go to the next slide. And so from there, you know, it kind of like the catalyst I think for the tribal partnerships program with NWF really seems like it begins with Buffalo, and then we continue on with working to protect the Colorado River. We also have some projects going on with protecting wildlife corridors and connectivity. And with that, that's making sure that we include tribes in those conversations, and that wildlife corridors and all of these wonderful and robust environmental conservation efforts. And while they're all very great, the purpose of it is so that tribes are not left out of that conversation, because they often do get left out. One of our other programs that we have is including equitable federal natural resource policy and funding. And that goes along the lines with what I just mentioned. And so one of my favorite projects, I guess I could talk about that, is working on the Colorado River. And that is something where, for myself as an Indigenous person, I'm also Diné Navajo, and knowing that my tribe is one of the tribes that is in the Colorado River Basin. And so we use the water, and that's something that has been, is in traditional stories and all sorts of things. And so with the Colorado River, the purpose of it is to protect cultural values of the river, the animals, and the plants. It's also protecting the ecological values of the rivers and the animals and the plants. We're also aiming to conserve all of these values, but ensuring that tribal perspectives and needs are recognized in the planning process. And our goal, well, we have already created a tribal river vision. And so this is in the works of trying to make sure that other tribes are able to sign on to this river vision, and so that we can really create some sort of a coalition, so that we can be able to have tribes participate fully in river management. Because I don't know if some people have seen the news, but we know that the river is a lot lower, and throughout history, like the Colorado River was over allocated to farmers. And so there's less water than what people think there is. And I will stop there, and so we can go on to the next slide. And so with this, we think about things like buffalo conservation, or we think about protecting the Colorado River, or maybe even what is the tribal perspective and tribal inclusion for Recovering America's Wildlife Act. We know that while we can exist in the Tribal Partnerships program, this really has to be an entire National Wildlife Federation goal to work with tribes. And things that we think about is like, well, what about tribal communities on the East Coast? I think that the Tribal Partnerships program is very focused in the West, because that's where a lot of it began, because the Wind River Reservation is located in Wyoming. And we know where the Colorado River is at. It's out here in the West, very dry out here. But to think about how do we expand to even all the sorts of wonderful programs that the National Wildlife Federation has, how do we make sure that we include tribes and Indigenous peoples in all those efforts? And so this is where we get to this point where the National Wildlife Federation is seeking, we're seeking partnerships based on trust, respect, and place-based conservation. And so we have hired an Indigenous consulting firm to develop a national tribal and Indigenous people strategy. Now we're on the last slide. And so here we have goals. Goals include to listen to and learn from Indigenous leaders, to forge, I think you have to there we go. We need to forge authentic relationships and partnerships across the country. We're looking to advance Indigenous policy priorities. We're going to help achieve greater place-based conservation, and also to help rectify environmental injustices. And so approaches to this includes proactively and purposefully opening doors, amplifying and elevating Indigenous voices, and also supporting the efforts of sovereign tribal governments and Indigenous communities to increase their capacity and influence to better achieve shared conservation goals this also will help to better address social, economic, and environmental justice challenges. And so I'm very excited about this tribal and indigenous people strategy, because this is something where it's no longer just the work of the Tribal Partnerships Program, but it becomes the work of NWF as a whole. And I think that that is the way that environmental justice can truly be achieved, is when we recognize and understand that indigenous people have to be included in these efforts. There's so much overlap of various communities that struggle with environmental injustices, and to know that there's continued efforts where things will go into policy and that tribes were never really consulted is disheartening. And we also need to understand that, like tribal communities are, well, there are some, some are federally recognized, some are not federally recognized, but these are still sovereign nations. And I think it's important that we understand what self-determination is, in which self-determination is the movement by which the Native Americans sought to achieve restoration of tribal community, self-government, cultural renewal, reservation development, educational control, and equal or controlling input into federal government decisions concerning policies and programs. And so this tribal strategy helps NWF to recognize that tribes are seeking, and that we have self-determination, and that there's also a federal trust responsibility that the government has to tribes, and that NWF, if we do so much in policy, we should also be playing a role in this as well. I think that is all I have for time, and so I really appreciate everyone listening to what I have, and I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'm going to pass it on to Jessica.
Thanks, Nizhooni. And thanks to Dr. Wilson and UMD and the Community Engagement, Environmental Justice and Health Lab for putting on this amazing symposium and for inviting us to speak. It's always an honor to hear from my colleagues and be inspired by them, and also to be with all of you today. So I'm going to close the panelist portion of our talk by talking about our work on environmental justice screening and mapping tools. And NWF's focus in this space is really on thinking through how can we ensure these tools are both highly effective and highly used to further environmental justice and climate justice. And so thinking about these tools as mechanisms of accountability, and be intentional about identifying where vulnerable communities are and driving investment and enforcement there. We're seeing an increasing interest in these tools at the federal level. The EJ Mapping and Data Collection Act that Rebeca mentioned earlier, mostly the creation of this new climate and economic justice screening tool was mandated by President Biden in his first week climate executive order. And I'm sure folks have seen some of the recommendations of what indicators should be in that tool from the CEEJH a few months ago. So I'm going to talk about some of the research and sort of outreach we've done in this space. And I should note up top that none of this work would have been even remotely possible without the work of Dr. Wilson and his lab and his students, all of it done in collaboration with them, and really relied so heavily on their leadership and expertise. So want to give credit where credit is due, and they deserve most of the credit here. So I'll do a really quick overview of what these tools are. I'm sure some folks are familiar or quite familiar with them, but just so we're all on the same page. These tools allow users to visualize patterns of environmental and climate hazards, and then you can sort of see which communities are and which communities aren't at risk from these hazards. So this is a screenshot of EPA's EJ screen, and which is the only sort of national environmental justice screening and mapping tool we have, which or sort of developed and maintained by the Environmental Protection Agency. In general, there are two types of indicators that are included in these tools: environmental indicators, and those can describe the physical environment and give information about community exposure. So this is things like groundwater contamination, air quality, water quality. Indicators, and those describe a community's potential susceptibility to environmental exposures. So these are things like levels of poverty, racial ethnicity data, linguistic isolation, educational attainment. So in this image, you see on the left lead paint, and on the right poverty indicators overlaid on a neighborhood in New Orleans. Both maps indicate areas with more households living below the poverty level and households with higher rates of lead paint exposure. So hopefully you can see what I mean when you say like there's a pattern here, and we can see that with these tools. But what makes them really powerful is they can allow us to not only visualize, but quantify cumulative and disproportionate environmental burdens, and therefore environmental injustices that certain communities face. So these tools can actually calculate a quantitative score for communities, which you can, is really useful, right? If you can compare to different communities or different states even. So Rebecca, if you click one more time, I think another screenshot will show up, thanks. This is a screenshot of California's environmental justice tool, CalEnviroScreen, showing the EJ score for neighborhoods in Eastern Los Angeles. Scores are in red. Higher scores equal, like a bigger EJ score is greater cumulative burdens, impacts, excuse me. So you can see this is also really useful if you're a policymaker thinking about where should I prioritize investment? Where should I prioritize enforcement? It's really powerful that these tools can calculate sort of a quantitative score. So go to the next slide, please. So it's really important, I think, also to note that these tools, when they're developed with robust community input and paired with thoughtful outreach and training, they can be really powerful instruments for education and advocacy for individuals and for communities. So they can really provide sort of accessible and hard data to back up lived experience. It's oftentimes hard to ignore community concerns about safety and quality of life when you have data and a tool to showcase it. That's an incredibly important part of these tools. My job at NWF, I sit on our climate and energy team on the policy side. We were coming to this issue focused on more the decision making. So how can we integrate these tools into decision making? How can we ensure that policymakers at the state and federal level know about these tools and use them to further environmental justice? So what have we done to sort of achieve that goal? In August of last year, we released a white paper. You can see here, and I'll drop the link in the chat in a second. This white paper was really to provide policymakers at both the federal and state level with guidance on how to improve government decision-making by using these tools. There's a pretty extensive, I think, academic literature on these tools and what they are and how they're developed and how they can be used. But we saw a need to really communicate that to like folks on the Hill and Senate and House offices, for example, or committee staffs who are writing legislation or thinking about investing in the EPA, and sure they know what these tools are, know the best practices for them, but then have some recommendations on integrating them into decision making. And then earlier this year, we were able to bring together some experts. Hold on, it's great for me to do two things at once. Here's the link in the chat for that white paper. Sorry, cannot multitask today. And so earlier this year, we were able to bring together some experts from the state, local, and regional level who had been involved in developing their versions of environmental justice training and mapping tools in a series of webinars to talk about sort of lessons learned, best practices, and how they had integrated these tools into decision-making in their own sphere of influence. We thought this was really important, especially as we're thinking about building this national climate and economic justice screening tool I mentioned earlier, to like learn from work on the ground and learn from what's worked and what hasn't. And in both of these products, we really prioritize outreach to Hill staff, outreach to federal agencies, including the EPA. And I have links to those webinars available if folks are interested in watching them. Just reach out to me. I can drop my email in the chat when I'm done talking. Next slide, please. So I want to spend a little time highlighting just a few of the policy recommendations from our white paper. I would encourage folks to read the whole thing. I think it's pretty great. It was co-written with Dr. Wilson himself. So ensure that these tools are properly funded and maintained. I know this probably seems like a no-brainer, but always good to remind folks that when you're writing legislation or funding an agency that you need to think for the long term. This is so important if we're thinking about updating data. You know, Sam mentioned earlier, the census just came out. We need to make sure that new census data is updated in EPA EJ screen, including new high resolution data sets, but also these tools are usable, that folks know they exist and know how to use them. So there's an education and training component here that also needs to be funded. Infusing these tools into COVID-19 related responses and other stimulus spending, really important if we're interested in getting sort of the most, in maximizing the use of our federal dollars. We should prioritize investment in communities that are hardest hit by COVID-19. Oftentimes, those communities are also environmental justice communities, and those communities are often communities that are more climate vulnerable. So we can use these tools to think about where to prioritize investment. Requiring states to have their own tools. We really see state tools as a complement to the national tool for a couple of reasons. We know that sort of factors that illustrate cumulative burdens differ between states and between communities, right? And state tools can incorporate data that's not relevant at a national level or not even available at a national level. is the Maryland's version of the tool, MDEJ screen, that Dr. Wilson and his team built and created as an accessible at the CEEJH Lab website. Includes indicators on supermarkets and like grocery store, local corner store locations, because in their outreach to develop the tool, stakeholders said that's really important to us in Maryland. We need to know where those tools are. That helps us determine, our ability to cope with environmental hazards and climate hazards. That's not necessarily data that's available at a national scale or relevant at a national scale, but it's really relevant to folks that live in Maryland. And so when you we see these tools as complementing each other, and really states should be supported and resourced to develop their own tools. Another policy recommendation that's not on here, but I want to touch on, is to include climate indicators and health indicators in these tools as well. We know that climate change compounds the burdens that environmental justice communities already face. And if we're interested in getting a more holistic picture of the cumulative burdens of EJ communities, we need to be including climate indicators like extreme heat, sea level rise, but also things that can confer climate resiliency into these tools. And I think there are ways to do this so you're not crowding the tool with too many indicators so it's getting statistically noisy. But we think that's really, really important. Last slide, please. Sorry, I'm powering through this because I want to get to the discussion point. But a little tease of sort of what we're working on now. And once again, major credit to Dr. Wilson and his team for taking the lead on this work. Exploring gaps in the kinds of information that existing environmental justice screening and mapping tools have. And we think this will be incredibly useful. We think and hope this will be incredibly useful for the new climate and economic justice screening tool at the national level. But also if we are, as a sort of resource for the Biden administration, as they're looking to assess whether they are meeting the goals of the Justice 40 initiative, and to sort of shape how that initiative works. I know we're going to talk a little bit about that in the discussion. Current tools still omit really crucial data pertaining to some things like social progress, economic progress, climate resilience, climate equity. And these are factors that are really important if you're thinking about understanding at a holistic level how a community can both withstand to and adapt to the effects of climate change. So Dr. Wilson and his team have done some amazing work, and hopefully, I think later next month, we'll be releasing a new report, white paper with some policy recommendations that looks at what are the indicator gaps, uses that information to identify a new set of recommended indicators that better represent the issues of climate resilience and climate equity, and then pair that with policy recommendations again, because a tool is only good if people are using it. So we're always going to be interested in making sure these are integrated into policymaking as best we can. So I'll just end with saying, like, these tools are not a silver bullet by any means. There are gaps in them, and I know there's a discussion right now with some much more technical and GIS experts than I am talking about some of the pitfalls and promises of each day mapping tools. They're not a silver bullet to solve the complex and interrelated challenges that EJ communities are facing by any means, but we really think they can and should be part of the solution. And that's really sort of been driving our work here. So I'll stop there. Thanks everybody for your time. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you for those excellent presentations, overview of the work that y'all are doing. We have about 11 minutes left, so I'm gonna go to a few of the questions for you to kind of dig more into some of the things that were mentioned in your presentation. So this first question, I'm not sure who would take it. What would you like to see from other big greens in regard to environmental justice work? I mean, just in general, what y'all are doing as it relates to engagement, just as a group, how should engaging communities impacted by EJ issues, frontline frontline communities, how should that engagement change? Who wants to take that question?
Yeah, so happy to kick us off here. I mean, it has to be central. I mean, it has to be really central into what Big Greens are doing and engaging folks to really understand the issues at hand. Because as mentioned earlier, I mean, these Big Greens, including National Wildlife Federation, Sierra Club, all these folks that have been, long-standing, have so much influence over policies, over how things move forward. And so when we're disconnected from people, everyday individuals, and the issues that they're facing, we can't really be those advocates that are necessary, right? And not only us, but we also have to make sure that we're opening the doors and making sure others are at the table, and moving that forward. And so I think I'd love for Big Greens to have that type of more interconnected relationship or a bridge, right, between these various different organizations on the front line that have had to do it for a long time, for decades on their own, out of preservation, out of being able to address the issues happening on the ground. So having more connection, building that bridge between frontline, fence line, community groups, and these Big Greens would just be amazing and phenomenal. And I think that's the only way to address the climate crisis.
Anyone else wants to chime on that question?
Yeah, I will just echo what Rebeca said. And I think another thing that I think Big Greens, including NWF, I guess should not do or try not to do is speak for environmental justice groups and environmental justice communities. I think oftentimes we're from an organization that is working at a national scale, but also with state and local and regional work. But we're structured differently. We're so much bigger, and we're not even the biggest of the Big Greens, right? But I think there's sometimes a tendency to, because you're trying to move in a political system where people want policy advice and sign off on bills really quickly, that we're speaking for or on behalf of EJ communities instead of taking the time to build authentic relationships and actually like open doors and use our privilege as other my colleagues have said. Otherwise, I think that's really, really crucial is we're not speaking for EJ communities, we're working with them and we're opening the door and letting them speak for themselves. And it takes more time and effort and work that we just need to prioritize doing it.
I think that's the best practice for all of us who are, support groups, proxies, open doors, and get out of the way, let the front line, fence line speak for themselves. And that gets back to principles 5 and 7 of the 17 principles of environmental justice. Anyone else want to chime in on this question? Oh, let me go to another question. Good. I'm gonna try to get a few questions in because I know we're running low on time. So I'm gonna skip around a little bit. I'm gonna follow up on this issue. A lot of some of the big greens you got, like you just said, you have big brands, right? You have these brands, right? So how can NWF and other big greens, use your brand to make sure that more funding, from donors and foundations are going to environmental justice work into those EJ groups, and make sure we're not repeating the mistakes of the past and the present, because we just recently saw the Bezos Fund, dropping money on certain big greens and other folks, and you've seen the Those of Color Network, saying that they did an analysis. I think Ana Batista did an analysis of them. So less than 1.3% of the funding for foundations going to environmental justice, climate justice work. So what's your role as a big green in helping to make sure that the funding from donors and foundations are going to those who are on the front line, fence line, doing the work, contextual experts? Who wants to chime in on that?
Yeah. Go ahead, Sam.
Sure, I'll do my best, but please, Rebeca, you're closer to so much of this. But yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest challenges is funding. I mean, that was going to be, if I had added to the last question, it would have been step back and give people funding, fund the work you actually want to see doing. Because if you look at an organization's dollars, that's how you see its values. I think we have a huge privilege as Big Greens because philanthropists are lazy and they just want to give money to a huge chunk of money to one organization to solve the problem for them. They don't want to build relationships with lots of other organizations. So I think it goes to what Jessica was just talking about and what Crystal talked about and Nizhooni talked about in terms of building transformational relationships. We need to be prioritizing having those relationships so that when we have those opportunities of huge funds of money coming to us, we can either pass that money through to the folks doing the work or say, actually, don't give it to us. You need to give it to this organization instead, because they're the ones doing the work, and know who to go to and know that we have the trust and the relationship there to be able to do that authentically and make those connections. And then I think we also just need to be advocates in all of our relationships with foundations and funders, that they need to stop funding us for huge sums of money over short periods of time. That really this work is about the long game. And if they want to actually make change, it needs to be a long-term investment in communities, because we get ourselves in a lot of trouble trying to jump in with a big pot of money that has to be spent in 6 weeks and then will disappear and go away. and really isn't building long-term power, isn't building the relationships, isn't really supporting the communities in the way that is needed. So that's just something we need to be, continuing to tell that story in all of our communications with funders.
Cool. Rebeca?
Yeah, well, definitely ditto on everything that Sam had mentioned, and really also using this opportunity to, as Sam had mentioned, for folks to fund relationship building, to be able to get in on the ground, and it doesn't have to be necessarily tied to a specific project, but really, advocating for practices where folks can free flow, kind of create their own project, address the issues that are happening at hand, and let them kind of connect it with, the issues happening in conservation and whatnot, because folks are experts in their own issues and problems and solutions as well. So we need to make sure to continue to advocate for that and push that, and also just be realistic with our capacity, right? I mean, we, yes, are a big green organization, but I think what folks sometimes don't realize, it's a couple folks kind of doing the work and moving it forward. And sometimes, as Sam had mentioned, I mean, we need to make sure that we're cognizant about what we can actually do and deliver, right? And if we can't do this, let's definitely connect them with different organizations on the ground. And we've been able to do that too. So I'm really happy to say that we have been sharing opportunities where we say, hey, to a specific organization that we know you might be interested in this, or hey, I understand that you also have low capacity in regards to, we don't have a financial department like we do, or a contracts department like we do. And maybe we can partner together where we can take more of that administrative work off your plate so you can move forward and do the work that you want to do. And so we can play different roles in those pieces. But again, advocating and making sure that others have the opportunities is extremely key.
Oh, thank you for that.
Yeah, I'm sorry if I could just jump in and
go ahead, Crystal.
Thinking outside the box and working with some of the non-traditional partners, because everyone is right. I think partnerships is really key in a lot of the questions that we've talked about, having good partnerships, people that we know that are actually doing the work on the front lines. So I would just say, one thing that I definitely advocate for with NWF is just, like we did in Georgia, we worked with the Civic Georgia, we worked with Poles to the Peaches, we worked with organizations that typically enviro organizations might not be tapping, but I thought it was a really, really key thing in our ability to get out the vote. So I would just say, to add to everything else, ditto everything else everyone else said, and be willing to work outside the box with maybe some non-traditional partners.
Yeah, that's an important point you're making. Yeah, in the Donors of Color Network session, we talked about, with foundations giving money for capacity building. And so there's a lot of communities who just helping with the capacity so they can be engaged, so that's an issue. And also you make an important point, Crystal, about, I like to say, engage the social infrastructure that's already in the communities. Activate, there's already infrastructure, maybe they're not working on this particular environmental issue, but you connect, as you heard me say in other sessions, connect to the things that matter to people, right? Justice matters to folks. I talked about food, faith, family, health, and jobs. Those things matter to people, right? So if you do that, then you always can find a partner because you're connecting, you're prioritizing things that matter to them. So thank you for those that thinking outside the box comment, Crystal. Any other comments on this question? Y'all want me to go to another one? I know, we're low. We're basically almost out of time. I know we want to go. I'm going to take one more question off the list. So let me get one more question, y'all. The Justice 40 question. This President Biden's Justice 40 initiative does little to ensure that the EJ communities receive funding beyond the benefits produced by relevant federal investments. How can your organization and similar organizations enhance and supplement federal commitments to ensure groups on the frontline fence lines are funded adequately? So who wants to take that last? This is our last question for this session.
Well, I can start because I have thoughts and opinions on this. Yes, I mean, I think we can use using the I said that GIS tools are not a silver bullet, and they're not, but I think they can be a particularly powerful tool in this instance as an accountability mechanism to understand and so this new climate and economic justice tool could help do this, or a related tool or data dashboard. We need to be tracking where federal dollars are going and what kinds of communities they're going to understand whether we're meeting the goals of Justice 40, and B, are we actually furthering environmental justice and climate justice with our investments. So if we were able to track where climate and environmental funds from the federal government were going and flowing into communities, and then also track how are those communities benefiting from those funds, I think it's absolutely crucial as an accountability mechanism to to show that it's one thing to have Justice 40. It's an incredibly powerful thing and a huge commitment from this administration. But now we need to see the work behind it and make sure that we're actually meeting those goals. And that means we need to know where the money is going and how it's being spent and what kinds of communities it's going to. And I think that sort of tracking and accountability piece is absolutely crucial.
Thank you. That's a powerful statement. Anyone else wants to chime in?
Yeah, I just really quickly just say as well that we need to, in terms of we've heard discussions with folks about different practices as well that we need to make sure to implement and raise as well, right? Making sure that there's funding that's going directly to local communities, for example. We see all this bureaucracy and issues that happen. And so we need to make sure that we're, continuously, uplifting equitable practices and not just, going for that policy. And yes, we have a commitment now, but how do we implement it? And we as a federation have the resources, tools to make sure that we get folks to know about these opportunities, for example, and that we're using our media platforms to share information. For example, with the CECC, we were able to bring folks from Justice 40 Accelerator to talk to different organizations about the different opportunities for capacity building to prepare individuals for this federal funding that's coming. So we have the opportunity, we have the information. We just need to make sure to continue to share it, uplift it, and use those lenses as we advocate for policies as well.
Can I add one thing in there too?
Yep.
Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
But I will also say too, something that the Tribal Partnerships team has been thinking about and that we have, I guess, advocated for in this tribal and indigenous engagement strategy for the entire organization is considering and hopefully one day having an indigenous or a Native American lobbyist, somebody that's in DC that is able to lobby for tribal and indigenous issues so that those concerns are heard and met and all of that, while, because there's a lot of information transferring and it's the work is here and then it's way over here. And I think just hopefully expanding that team so that we're able to actually receive the funding that we, or not us, but that tribes are able to receive the funding that they deserve and that NWF can be a true advocate for tribal and indigenous communities, Washington, DC, and beyond.
No, thank you for that great comment. So I want to thank our panelists from National Wildlife Federation for this great session. Y'all jam-packed with a lot of information. You lived up to what I do, jam-packing it. So it was good. I think we put I had Rachel put a lot of the posts in the Hoover page, the platform, so people can learn more and read about the reports and all the great work you're doing. But thank you again for a great session, and thank you for being a great partner, and thank you again for this youth leadership, youth movement, National Wildlife Federation, to move it forward, to change the culture and how you're supporting communities that are trying to address environmental justice issues. So appreciate you, appreciate all your work, and thank you again for a great session. And hopefully all of you will be able to join us in our closing session that begins in 6 minutes. So thanks, everybody. Great job.
Thanks very much, Dr. Wilson.
Yep, you're welcome.